Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Higgins. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Strategen Consulting, and I am delighted to have all of you joining us today for this inaugural webinar in a new series that Strategen is putting on in partnership with Sandia National Laboratories and the U.S. Department of Energy. Today's webinar is called Storage for Resilience. It's the first part of a two-part series. Today's webinar will be on applications and technologies. This webinar series is actually part of a broader webinar series that we're conducting in partnership with Sandia and the U.S. Department of Energy, and we're really delighted that you could join us. We'll give it just another minute before we continue on to make sure that everyone's been able to get on. So if you could all just hold on for one moment, we'll be right back with you. All right, everyone, it is 11:02. We will go ahead and get started here. So let's just cover a little bit of housekeeping before we begin the webinar today. So I want to make everybody aware that today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be made available after the webinar. The slides are also going to be available in the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel if you're interested in taking a look at it through there. And all participants except the panelists are on mute mode. We have approximately 650 people that are supposed to be on the webinar today, so it would be mass pandemonium if we let everybody speak when they raise their hand. So if you do have questions, I want to make sure that you're aware of how to do that through GoToWebinar. What you will do is there's a little question box down at the bottom of your panel, and you can type in a question there, and we'll have someone from our team that's going to be emceeing things and recording all the questions and getting questions to our panel as time allows. So you can also choose between computer and phone-based audio for this, and you should all be seeing slides available up on the screen as well right now. But if not, you can get the slides later. All right, moving on. So as we mentioned, this is the first webinar, this is the inaugural webinar in a series of webinars on energy storage that we're putting on, which is a pillar of a broader energy storage knowledge hub that Strategen has been working on in partnership with Sandia National Labs and with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy. So first I want to thank Sandia and U.S. Department of Energy for all of their support in this. The goal of our Knowledge Hub is really to educate the public about energy storage technology, foster the exchange of ideas between utilities, policymakers, industry, manufacturers, technology providers, developers, and all sorts of industry stakeholders. And as we mentioned, today's session is the first of a two-part series on storage for resilience. We also have coming up a webinar on storage as a wholesale market resource. Followed by a webinar on rate design trends for behind-the-meter storage. So these are going to be occurring monthly on the second Thursday of the month for the next 4 months. Hopefully this will continue well beyond the 4 that we have outlined here, but these are the first 4 that we've identified right now. So you can go on to our website, which is linked below to register. And right now we've got registration open for part 2 of the Storage for Resilience series. We'll be posting registration for the other 2 webinars shortly as well. All right, so today's agenda, we're covering some of the announcements, and we got a few introductions that we want to provide, the most important of which is going to be Sandia National Labs, our partner in this energy storage knowledge hub that we're working on. And we really want to thank them for their partnership and support for many, many years on work that we've been doing with them in the energy storage space. And at this time, I want to introduce Jackie Hernandez from the Energy Systems Analysis Group at Sandia, just to say a few words about the work that they're doing in grid modernization. So, Thomas, if you could unmute Jackie and allow her the opportunity to introduce what Sandia is up to in grid mod and energy storage. Jackie, you're open.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Hernandez. I am a member of staff with the Grid Mod groups at Sandia Labs, located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We're managed by a subsidiary of Honeywell International for the Department of Energy. And I'd like to say welcome, and that this webinar series is just absolutely spectacular. It represents a partnership with the Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Reliability and Delivery, Sandia Labs, and Strategen Consulting. The slide that is presented here is a snapshot of the nature of the research and development work that is conducted at Sandia to address various infrastructure threats and vulnerabilities in the national interest. And as you can see, it's pretty wide and varied, where we have work dealing with cyber and physical attacks, as well as the impact on aging infrastructure. And our goal is to do certain capabilities such as enhance system reliability and adapt to rapid recovery from power disruptions. Also to have a market system that supports increased consumer choice. This exchange today speaks to our concern about resilience, where the emphasis is on having energy storage as a grid asset. I thank you for coming. If there are questions, our moderator will conduct you on how to submit those post-webinar. So in closing, on behalf of Dr. Emery Zook of DOE and Dr. Babu Shalamala, my manager at Sandia, I'd like to again thank you for attending, and I'm sure we will have a great series.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Really appreciate that. Now, just a little bit about Strategen. We are experts in grid modernization, grid transformation. We work for governments, regulators, utilities, and industry around the world on questions around strategy, economics, regulations, and technology issues in all sorts of grid modernization issues, but storage is an area where we're particularly well known. Our goal is to offer a broad ecosystem of knowledge, networks, and services for the electric power industry, of which this knowledge hub that we're working on with Sandia is one aspect. And the portal to our energy storage knowledge hub is actually the global energy storage database that we've been working on in partnership with Sandia National Labs for many years now. This database of energy storage projects is a global tool that is used by industry and policymakers all around the world to inform what's happening in the energy storage space. We currently have about 1,700 projects online that represent nearly 200 gigawatts of power capacity. We are continually expanding the capabilities and features of the tool, and but it's only as good as the input that we get from industry. So we really do encourage crowdsourcing of projects to include in the database. You can go online, you can submit projects that you're involved in. We'll get them on there as soon as we can and make sure that it's accurate. We do all sorts of vetting and peer review of projects that are on here to make sure that the information we have in the tool is accurate. Another component of our storage ecosystem is the event series that we run. Energy Storage North America is one of those events. It's coming up here in November. It's the 6th to the 8th in Pasadena this year. So I just wanted to invite everybody to attend. Here's a little bit of information about who we have as keynotes this year, and the registration can be completed at esnetexpo.com. All right, and with that, I want to introduce today's panel. First, I'm going to introduce the moderator for our panel, Thomas Lee. Thomas is a director in the consulting group at Strategen, and he specializes in serving clients in product technology and corporate strategy. Prior to Strategen, he was a senior product manager at Enphase Energy, responsible for product solutions in Australia and the Asia Pacific region. And before that, he did market research and global expansion strategy development. All right, now I'm going to turn things over to Thomas to introduce the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you, Mark. We have two great speakers today, John Berdner from Enphase Energy and Lee Cravath from Pice Energy Solutions. They're both longtime veterans in the power industry, and I'm really delighted that they could join us today. Thank you both for being here. John has 35 years of PV industry experience and has been active in codes and standards development for more than 20 years. He serves on several technical standards panels, including UL 1741, co-chairs 1741 Supplement A. He's also a co-chair for IEEE 1547 and 1547.1, and as well as serving as an alternate voting member on NFPA Code-Making Panel 4, which writes NEC Articles 690 and 705. In the last few years, he's also been an active member of the California Smart Inverter Working Group and the Hawaii Smart Inverter Technical Working Group. At Enphase, John is responsible for product compliance with codes and standards globally and represents the company on numerous standards development bodies. Today, he's going to be talking about Ensemble, one of Enphase's solutions for DR control and power backup. Lee is Director of New Ventures for PICE Energy Solutions, where he evangelizes PICE's advanced controller technology, which is a patented high-speed advanced grid control technology developed to meet the evolving needs of the modern energy ecosystem. He has over 3 decades of experience in energy and technology industries. And prior to PICE, he was Director of New Ventures for Semper Renewables, where he was responsible for leading the development of distributed energy solutions, including solar, load optimization, biomethane, EV charging, blockchain, and microgrids. He also serves on the board of directors of the Gridwise Alliance, and he's been twice named one of the top 100 movers and shakers in smart grid by Green Tech Media, and twice as a top 12 mover and shaker by Utility Industry Magazine. And he's been recognized as a privacy ambassador by the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. I want to thank you again both for being here today. Before we get to the presentations, I'd like to spend a few minutes to give a little bit of background for our discussion today, since I know we have a very diverse audience. I want to make sure that everybody is familiar with some of the topics that we're going to be discussing. So firstly, why are we here today? Why is it important to be talking about resilience? I think, well, basically, it comes down to the fact that there are a lot of things that can cause disruptions to electric service, and the impact of those disruptions can be very severe. Right? You have things like weather and natural disasters, which has certainly been in the news a lot over the last year. We've had several storms affecting many parts of the country. We've had wildfires here. I'm sitting in California at the moment, and that's been, an issue certainly in the past year or so as well. In both cases, these resulted in multi-day outages in affected areas, and even in some cases, you have utilities actually thinking about preemptively de-energizing parts of the system in order to prevent additional damage and additional catastrophe. So you've got impacts that multiply upon each other. We have security incidents. So within the last few weeks, we had some publicity around cyber attacks on U.S. and European power plants and control centers. We also have physical attacks. So again, being here in the Bay Area in California, there was a few years ago an actual attack on a substation where several transformers were damaged. And then, of course, we're dealing with human beings and equipment. So there's always the prospect of accidents, errors, and failures that can cause outages as well. So again, it's very important for us to think about resilience. But what is it exactly? And that's that's often it's an issue and a topic of great discussion and debate in the industry right now. Right? You have several definitions that are floating around. I mean, you have the one that comes from the dictionary, right, which talks about being able to recover or recover a shape or a state. Which is a very general definition. The Department of Homeland Security has a definition as well that kind of refers to infrastructure. Getting more specific to the power industry, NERC and FERC both have definitions that they work with. But they're all slightly different, and even other players in the industry, whether they be utilities, whether they be governments and emergency responders, they all have different definitions of what it means to be resilient. It's something that's evolving. It's something that's part of the discussion. And then there's not really yet an agreed definition within the industry. So why is it so hard? And I think one of the reasons is that there's the issue of trying to differentiate between resilience and reliability. These are two terms that they're related, but they're different, and they're often kind of conflated with each other. Right? NERC has a definition for reliability. It has specifications that go around it and metrics that measure it, but there aren't they don't have these kinds of metrics for resilience. And I think one of the things that often happens is people, like I said, conflate them, because I think in order to be reliable, you have to be resilient, right? And then reliability also has resilience also has an aspect of reliability within it. Another reason that I think it's often difficult is that resilience needs to incorporate, it's not just about the grid itself, it's not just about the physical electric delivery service, it's actually about the impact that a disruption has on the community, on the services that that community can provide that aren't directly related to electric power. So that might be things like medical care, security, food, shelter, transportation. And so, once you start to add all of these external factors in, it makes it very difficult to measure. Although, there are people who are trying to do this, and I know Sandia has several people who are actually doing some leading work on this issue. And it's something that, we're definitely actively tracking. It's something that we hope to be discussing again in the next session when we're talking about how do you deploy and how do you think about resilience kind of in a system context. The other thing that makes it difficult, I think, is that resilience actually means different things depending on the context where you're working. So, with respect to electric power, you might think about an individual site that's talking about backup power, just trying to restore functions on that particular site. If you're responsible for a community or an area, you might be having to triage a little bit in terms of which sites are priorities to bring back up. You might need to be coordinating these together in a microgrid fashion. You may also want to think about temporary resources or mobile resources and things like that. So, trying to kind of get yourself back to some sort of interim state before the whole system can get back up and running again, where you need, and if you're a system operator, you're actually thinking about how do I actually have to kind of restart this entire system to get you back into a normal operating state. Since we're talking about storage today, I think storage does have a role to play in each of these contexts. So, for example, if you're a site, if you're a site manager and responsible for a particular facility, be it your own home or a commercial building or something like that, you're thinking about how do you back up and just provide temporary power to your critical load. So that might be, if you're in a home, that might be a refrigerator. Let's say, if you're a hospital, and maybe particular pieces of equipment and things like that. If you're in a community, responsible for a community, say your emergency services office, right? You're thinking about how do you again, look at storage. For the community to get it back up and running. There's a great example here, last year, the city of San Francisco, actually with funding from the DOE, actually put together a plan for how they might use solar and storage for resilience. And they've published this in a report that includes not just their own planning roadmap, but also best practices and an online sizing tool to figure out how much solar and storage you might need for a particular site. Certainly, encourage you to go check out those links for those resources. And actually, glad to announce that we actually will be having a representative from San Francisco speaking at the next webinar on this topic. So please, I hope you can join us for that discussion. For temporary and mobile resources, I'm sure again, this is what's been going on in Puerto Rico is a pretty good example of this, where a lot of people have come in with storage resources, to back up and restore some partial service to parts of the island. So after the recent hurricanes, and then there's talk now of how do you actually rebuild the system to incorporate these kinds of resources so that when the next storm comes, there'll they'll be more resilient and more responsive and can bring service back more quickly. Black Start, in terms of bringing the whole system back online, this is about basically restarting power plants and stabilizing the grid. Right? So, a great example happened last year. Imperial Irrigation District, for the first time in the U.S., used battery storage to actually restart and black start a gas plant. And in addition to using that battery to start the plant, once the plant was started, they were actually able to switch that battery to become a load to help stabilize that generator while it was in its startup phase, before it could reintegrate back into the system. So you can also think about how storage might be able to, because it's a fast-acting resource, be able to actually help provide stability to the grid as it's starting back up when it's in a very fragile state. So, these are just a few examples of how storage can enable resilience. But the thing about resilience is that it's not just storage alone. Right? Storage has to work in conjunction with other parts of the system. It's not just the resources. You need sensing, you need control, you need communications, and most importantly, you actually need a plan. You need to figure out actually how you're going to get your system back up and running. How are you going to restore those services to the community? In a very sort of systematic and pre-thought out way, because otherwise, something happens and you're not necessarily going to know what to do. You need to have that thought out ahead of time. So for today's session, we're going to be focusing more on the actual specific technology aspects of it, and the planning and things like that we'll cover in the next session. But for today, this leads us to sort of our panel discussion, and we're going to be focusing more on kind of the sensing and the control on how you use storage and to actually be able to provide a resilient service to different parts of different levels of the grid. So to start, I'm going to turn things over to John Bergner over at Enphase, and he's going to talk about an Ensemble, which is Enphase's upcoming solution in this space. I can, and so John, I will give you the control, and
thanks, Thomas. I'm trying to figure out how to take control here, but
there you go. Okay, so you should have control, and feel free to begin.
All righty. Thank you, Thomas. As Thomas mentioned, we used to work together a couple of years ago at Enphase, and so Thomas was aware of some of the things that we were working on at Enphase and thought it would be a good fit. In terms of Ensemble, I would say this has been debuted in some small groups publicly, but first time we've really talked about it on a public webinar like this. So let's see, I'm not able to advance the slides, Thomas.
Sorry about that.
What?
How's that?
Yep. So maybe we'll just do the next slide thing, and we'll walk through it. So just to give a very quick overview of Enphase, we're a manufacturer of inverters. They're Marco inverters. So our smallest one is around 300 watts, roughly 700,000 systems installed in 110 countries, and that translates to over 16 million individual inverters. And we have a communication infrastructure that goes along with the product. And we're currently communicating with roughly 12 million devices, I believe. And we essentially get 5-minute data from all 12 million of those devices worldwide every day. So it's a tremendous amount of data, and having that communication capability, as Thomas said, gives you a whole lot of ability to adjust things and change things when they're not exactly as they should be. Next slide. In terms of the way we approach resiliency, would include typically solar array with microinverters on the roof. It would include a storage component, although it's actually, with the Ensemble technology, it's not entirely required to have storage, but obviously I think that's the most useful way to employ the system. It also involves an energy hub, which kind of monitors the power flow, normally at the point of interconnection, or the intertie point, as we call it when we talk about microgrids. And then remote management, either via our server or in coordination with a utility or a microgrid operator. And then one important thing, to get the most resilient system, you also want to be able to monitor and, in some cases, control your consumption. For example, during a prolonged outage, you may want to forego having HVAC in the home so that you have more energy available for more critical loads. Next slide. So as Thomas talked about it, we also look at it and what is resiliency. In the early days of solar, when I got started, there was no grid-tied market. It was all off-grid. So resiliency was kind of inherent because people were building off-grid systems so they could be their own power plant. And then with the advent of the grid-tied power market, I think resiliency for me, it means being able to answer a very common question when people are buying solar systems. Essentially, at some point, the question comes up: okay, if the grid goes down, you're telling me that this solar system doesn't work. And historically, the answer is yeah, because the inverters were required to shut down, required to disconnect. And so there really wasn't much of an option there other than having sort of a dual use with redundant assets and things like that. There wasn't really a good answer. So with the advent of what we call Ensemble, the answer becomes no, you will have power, at least some level of power during outages. And for us, the critical aspect here is no matter what the size of your system. So whether you have a small PV system only, PV plus storage, a big system, you would still at least have that capability to provide some power during certain times of the day. So that's from the system owner perspective. I would say grid resiliency, as Thomas pointed out, is kind of the ability of the grid to break apart and reassemble during these major events, while at least providing some reasonable level of service to customers. And historically, up until just a couple of years ago, that was really difficult to do because of some of our regulatory restrictions that we had in place. We just published, actually last week, a new version of IEEE 1547, which is the new the interconnection standard for the United States. And it adds some new functionality, which actually makes it easier or even possible to implement functionality that would provide resiliency. And principally, that's in the form of voltage and frequency group, ride-through, tripping, and most importantly, I think, is some standardized interoperability requirements so that these systems can communicate to the utility or to whoever is operating the microgrid during one of these events. And then we also have some companion standards which have recently been updated, which are around the communication and control of microgrids, which is in the 2030 series of standards. And then when we look at resiliency internally, if you say, okay, how could I have the highest possible level of resiliency? That would be achieved when every customer that's connected to the utility grid can supply all their own power needs independently, or can participate in a local microgrid of whatever arbitrary configuration that might be, up to and including, the whole bulk power system, which essentially would be, grid-tied solar with behind-the-meter PV and storage and demand response. Next slide. Okay, so as an inverter company, our building block is the inverter, the new inverter, which is just moving out of the development stage and moving into field testing stage, is what we call the IQ8. It's an 8th generation inverter, and it's the building block of the ensemble system. The key to that is the ASIC, which is an application-specific integrated circuit, and essentially that's all of the grid controls on a single chip. The device, excuse me, is 295 VA, or commonly most folks would say watts, and 450 VA during overloads. And overloads are for like starting motors and things like that, where you need a higher amount of power for a short period of time. It's roughly 97% efficient in either direction. So either as taking DC energy and creating AC, or the other way around, if it's charging a battery, for example. And it's what we call grid forming or grid supporting. So it can operate in grid tied mode, where it's supporting a grid, or it can operate in a grid forming mode, where it's essentially creating the grid on its own. And it does that by using advanced group controls. And so far, it's stable under all load conditions and stable with all linkage impedances. And that's really important, because if you have a local system where you have undefined impedances between individual systems, you need to make sure that the system is fairly robust and can accommodate wide ranges of the impedances that you might find between them. Next slide, please. The system has sub-cycle characteristics, which means it's actually adjusting the voltage and current many times per cycle on the utility grid. And right now, the controller that we have in the IQ8 is accurate up to about 10 kilohertz. And then above that, it's essentially going to appear like its output filters, which are tuned to 10 kilohertz. So anything below 10 kilohertz, we can essentially change the shape of the voltage and current waveform as needed. And we can adjust things like harmonics. We can adjust power factor. We can dampen subcycle harmonics. All that stuff is possible, which can all be potential benefits to the grid moving forward. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we think a lot about at Enphase, because we make lots of little things, is how to control many little things that are distributed versus a centralized control. And so historically, when you had a backup power solution, it was very common for them to be AC coupled, where you have multiple inverters that are connected together on the AC power system within the facility. And the common approach was to use a master-slave topology, where you had one master that was essentially establishing the voltage, and then multiple slave sources, which were current sources, and they were essentially following the lead of the voltage source device. We don't do it that way. We've gone to a different approach of control, which is hierarchical control, and that's exactly the same architecture that's used by the grid today. So we have 3 levels of control. We have primary control, which is what governs the voltage and frequency stability of the system, and that's embedded in a DSP, a digital signal processor, in each inverter, and it's running at over 100 kilohertz. So it's very fast and it's very capable. So each individual device can operate 100% autonomously, and it's also distributed, and that leads to a very robust system. The secondary control would be, which would determine, I would say, power quality and that is controlled by an external controller, which we manufacture, and that uses power line carrier communication. So it's using the same wiring within the facility that is used for moving the power. We're also using that same wiring and cabling for the communication, and that's occurring at about 1 hertz. It's not distributed. That is starting to be centralized control. However, it's also not mission critical. So if there's a communication interruption, the system doesn't fail because the primary control will continue to keep the system stable even in absence of a secondary control signal. And then we rely on tertiary control, which is a third level of control. And we view that primarily as an economic optimization of the system. And the power line carrier would update that about every 5 to 15 minutes. And that will optimize the energy flow primarily based on economic drivers, but it could also be based on commands or requests from external, from the utility company, for example, from the microgrid operator, from any external event, which could essentially override the economic optimization to use those assets for other purposes. Next slide. So the hierarchical control is universal. So we're using the exact same controller, whether it's for on-grid or off-grid. And the primary difference there is in off-grid, what we do is we set essentially an intertie, what we call a schedule, intertie schedule. And that's basically at the control point where you would typically intertie to the grid. We put an isolation device. We would isolate from the grid. And then simultaneously, we would set the intertie schedule to produce basically zero power and zero reactive power at that intertie. So it tells the system that there can't be any power flow to the grid since the system is essentially disconnected from the grid. And then we have a tie line bias control signal that then sets a bias to make sure that the system is maintaining the voltage and frequency targets of the intentionally islanded system. And when it's in a grid tied mode, where it's tied to the full bulk power system, or it may be tied to a smaller grouping, which could be a sister system or perhaps a backup engine generator or something like that. The telemetry can be sent to the upstream controller, which defines the capabilities of everything that's downstream of the intertie point. And this idea of bidirectional.
Sorry to interrupt. John, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
We are starting to get a little bit short on time, so if there's a couple of key points you'd like to wrap up with, I want to make sure that we have enough time for Lee and for questions.
Sure. Go ahead. Go next slide. So just to demonstrate how the system works, here's a waveform, a scope capture of the left-hand part of the slide is showing the system connected to the grid. You can see the yellow curve is voltage, and you can see that the voltage is a little bit low. And then about in the middle of the slide, you see that a disconnection occurs. So the system's now isolated from the grid. However, you see that the voltage ramps up slowly over the next couple of cycles and remains stable. And what you see there is the green line would be the power contribution from the PV array, and the blue line would be the power contribution from the AC battery. But you see it's virtually a transparent transition. Next slide, please. One of the important things about the way we implement the control is it's essentially recursive. So at the most basic level, it's the same control structure that's used in the facility to a neighborhood, to a region, to the whole grid, and it's the same structure and the same commands that are promoted above or below the control node. Next slide. It's robust. Basically, when communications, when control is disrupted, it's a multi-tiered control system, so it remains robust. Even if you have hardware failures, the system essentially is self-healing, and so it makes it even more reliable because of the way the system fails. When it fails very gracefully. Next slide. It's flexible. It's essentially sets itself up. It's pretty straightforward to install, and it can be customized remotely. It can be expanded at any time without having to reconfigure it, and so on. Let's go to the next slide, because I'm trying to hurry through this. So the early test results, Donnie Zamanek, who's the principal engineer on the project, has been living with the system here, and one of the goals is figuring out how small system we can use. So he has an eight microinverter system. 6 are connected to batteries, 2 are connected to PV modules. So that's about 2.4 kilowatts or 3.6 kilowatts peak, and about 9 kilowatt hours of storage. And it's backing up his entire house. And as he says, the refrigerator, microwave, the gas furnace, his various loads, and his wife who's watching Netflix. Next slide. So some of the early observations, and we've been trying to figure out what's the smallest possible system that people could get away with. And one of the things that we found is that the loads the traditional loads in the home are surprisingly tolerant of brownouts, but they're not very tolerant of voltage spikes. So some of the loads that he's run, yes, you'll see a brownout, and it could cause some digital clocks to reset, but with a little bit higher power level, it's noticeable, but it works. His microwave oven has been fine. As he said, causes the lights to dim, but it did pop the popcorn. And in case of a deep well pump, we've set a criteria of the same type of abnormal operation criteria that's in IEEE 1547. And again, this is an extreme test. We expected this to happen, but the brownouts become very severe. And based on our modeling, if he had added an additional 4 microinverters, he could have maintained the power quality within IEEE 1547 limits. But that's still a very small system relative to the number of loads that system is operating. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, John. Appreciate you taking the time to do that. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Lee, and as soon as I can get. And Lee, the mic is yours, and I can control the slides for you.
Hey, thank you. And can you confirm that you can hear me?
We can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. All right. So if you might as well go to the next slide right away. You know, in my bio, it talks a little bit about my time at Sandia National Electric, and I need to say that PICE Energy Solutions is not the same company as the California Utilities, Sandia Gas and Electric Company, or Southern California Gas Company, and PICE is not regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission. So I have to say that, being that we're owned by Sempra, and you can see PICE down in the right-hand corner. What I did want to say, I won't go into details on this slide. You know, Sempra Renewables has about 3 gigawatts of renewables, wind and solar. So we're very committed, to renewable energy. But back when I did work for SDG&E, I was on the job for a few months when I realized, this is back in 2009, that energy storage, I used to call it the holy grail of the future of the energy system. And recently I was arguing with somebody who produces really inexpensive solar about what the most important thing was. And I told them, well, really what I've learned now is the most important thing is software, a control system that can control a system that doesn't have inertia, that is inverter-based. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful coincidence that while I was at Sempra in the renewables organization, Patrick Lee and Chuck Wells, the 2 co-founders of PICE, came together on this technology, got super excited about it, and let me join the team, because I think it's kind of, the dream of a sustainable future is to have something like this. If you want to go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so what I kind of did here, it's just really a high level, while storage is super important, and I talked about the need for control technology, you need to, I think the future that a lot of us are looking at is a federated network of microgrids where they're all working together. And I have here a picture of an island. This is without, with current legacy control technology. And what you can see here is that you have plenty of energy, you have lots of renewables, you have lots of thermal energy, but if you have an outage, you can easily take the entire island down, and there's a little island in the corner that maybe would continue to go on its own. And the problem with this configuration, by the way, this configuration totally exists. I will show you, this is not an island that we're talking to, but it's a real island. And when you have this kind of configuration, you have all your thermal generation is really running in spinning reserve capacity, just waiting for issues to arise with variability of renewable energy. So you have very inefficient thermal generation. Also, you can see some of the solar panels and some of the wind turbines are see-through, and that's kind of showing that sometimes they're curtailed. So when you have too much wind blowing and the sun is shining, the thermal generation can't handle the changes that might happen with a lot of renewables. So the renewables are curtailed, and you're taking 0-cent energy that's being produced anyway, and you're replacing it with very inefficient, basically spinning reserve type of thermal energy. So that's a big challenge. You can also notice that there's plenty of land on those solar and wind little blue discs where you could put more solar and you could put more wind, but there's a cap, and there's a cap because of that same issue that you can't put more on, or you wouldn't be able to have enough spinning reserve to pick it up. So just a bunch of issues with the current situation, and this is not fictional. This is the situation that you find on most islands. So if we go to the next slide, it might look exactly the same. There's only a little bit of change. And what we did here is we added some PICE controllers and we added energy storage. And I can consider this like an incredibly resilient federated network of microgrids. So let me explain it a little bit. That PICE that we kind of have in the control center, that PICE server is able to control the island as one, so you're truly optimized with all your resources. You see there's a lot more solar now and a lot more wind, and whether it's the central wind and solar or whether it's in the neighborhoods, all of that is being controlled by PICE and used in order to optimize for the environment, and optimize by cost. And you can actually have, with the PICE technology, 100% inverter-based technology, zero thermal. If the sun starts to set or the wind stops blowing, PICE will leverage the thermal generation to pick up what's not there. But first, PICE will do it with what it has in its energy storage. And the way that it works, I do want to get into that a little bit. I know time is short. Well, let me first say that the other servers, what they are doing is they are providing even the resiliency. So if there's any issues on the grid, any one of those PICE servers can take over and run what's left of the grid or pieces of the grid. And as long as you have a PICE server and storage, you can keep it going. And again, those mini grids or those microgrids can each also be 100% inverter based. And again, while there's sun and while there's wind, you don't need to go into your diesel or thermal generation. You can have any combination of those little islands can work together. And another nice benefit of that is that you can build this out over time. You can build one piece and another piece. Each piece would then be a functional microgrid that is heavy on the renewables. And then as you connect them, you're now getting a more optimized grid because you're taking advantage of, if the sun's shining in one place and not another place, or your load is different in one place than it is another place. You're now getting the benefit of different peaks and different valleys when they're attached, that they could survive alone. And see, we're going to the next slide. I think that was a hint. This is actually on the island of Maui, and this really happened. A few months ago, PICE was used to control the entire island of Maui. It's about 200 megawatt load. This was done with a 10 megawatt battery. We did have communication with grid operations and asked them at times based on PICE recommendations. PICE wanted the thermal generation to go up or down a little bit based on what was going on with renewables, but that was a slow process just to make sure there was enough energy or not too much energy on the grid for what the batteries can handle. But all the energy that was being generated was accepted onto the grid. PICE was able to control. You can see within the red box when PICE had control, that top graph, how tight frequency was. We are working with various islands on proposals to bring them to 100% renewables over time. And that's not necessarily RPS. It's up to, the economics of whether they want to buy more batteries and even more solar to fill it for nighttime. But during the day, while the sun is shining and while the wind is blowing, we can support configuration of distributed microgrids that all come together and run an entire island, really of any size. And as long as I'm talking about islands right now, if we go to the next slide, at least I'm waiting on my computer. We can also provide resiliency in the utility use case. Here's an example of a substation that maybe has a battery. We can also put it on the feeder. That could be there maybe to control voltage, to give voltage conservation, or just there's Rule 21 compliance issues to straighten that out. But while we can do that with just an inverter and with PICE, but while we're there, another option is to put energy storage there, and then we would be able to control that as a microgrid as well. And we do see a future one day, potentially, of where grids are built out like this. So an entire grid of a nation, of a city, of a state can all be able to be microgrids in the case of any kind of attack or large grid disturbance. The more distributed energy there was in the form of solar could support those batteries, keep it so they can get through the night with the battery. So we're looking at this use case. We're talking to a number of utilities about that as well. We're also in the middle of commissioning a winery in Sonoma that right now we're commissioning that. That'll be 100% solar for its tasting room and other parts of the winery. And that will be able to disconnect and reconnect at any time. What PICE does, if you go to the next slide, I think I'm going to go a couple of slides down here. Another slide, please. Just want to make sure we get to it given the time crunch. One more. Okay, one more. We're there. All right, the way that PICE works is it leverages standard synchrophasers. So these are under $1,000 when they don't exist already. But like on Maui, they already existed because they're built into relays and switches by many of the vendors. They're under $1,000. This is all off the shelf. The servers are off the shelf. The only thing that's ours is the software. But what it does is it gets the data from the synchrophasers. It uses them as sensors every cycle. So 60 times a second, we are getting data of the exact state of the grid as seen by the synchrophaser. Our engine crunches that very quickly and determines where it's off the exact requirement, whatever the set point is, bought by the needs of the grid or was set by the utility or whoever has it or the C&I customer. And then it figures out what it should be, and it sends new real and reactive set points to any of the inverters on the system. It also can communicate with other instances of PICE. so that's how we can really scale in a hierarchical fashion by looking at another instance of PICE as just another resource, which can give you exactly what you want using the resources, solar, wind, batteries that it can control. It gives them new set points. And then, of course, the very next cycle, it's again reading what the grid state is. And so as it runs, it actually gets stronger and smarter because it's learning. It's reading about whether its actions need to be tweaked and whether its algorithm inside needs to be tweaked. And it's keeping that grid, this is why it could be 100% inverter based, it's keeping that grid with very, very excellent quality power by doing that algorithm. So I kind of went through a bunch of things very fast, so to get us back on time a little bit. But I do want to thank Strategen, Sandia National Labs, and the Department of Energy. We think we have a pretty exciting product that can really make a difference in the world, and they're letting us get that message out. So thanks a bunch.
Great. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, John. So we've got quite a few questions, and we are fairly short on time, so I'll try to summarize some of these. Just as a reminder, folks, if you do have a question, feel free to type it into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. A couple people asked about slides. Yes, the slides will be made available. So just one quick question to start. There's a question here about scaling, and we're talking about John's solution is talking about a single site, like a home, something that's not necessarily in the utility's control, whereas Lee, your solution has a bit wider scope. How do these work together, and are they compatible with each other?
This is Lee. So we anticipate that, so we can be very small scale. As I said, we're at a winery under a megawatt load, but we could go small. We can also go extremely large, and we really do think that we could do a nation because of the hierarchical approach. And we don't have any, belief that we can control every one of those devices. There are going to be devices that we can control and devices that we can't, and we just need enough control that we can keep the power quality correct. So, for example, we could work with Enphase by sending them, commands of what we would need, and then as long as they carried it out, we expect different speeds of different other controllers out there. We can basically be the manager of other controllers, the manager of resources, no matter who the manufacturer is.
Yeah, and from the Enphase perspective, we would essentially view the commands coming from this controller essentially as a tertiary control, or potentially secondary control, depending on how the hierarchical control is implemented. So we would primarily be just a question of writing the interfaces between the two. But essentially, this is exactly the type of control structure that we are trying to build out, and we believe is the right way to go.
Hey, we should probably get that done.
Great. Yeah. There's another question here about how do you deal with large motor pickup when you're since we're talking here about storage and inverter-based systems. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think that it really comes to a question of resource adequacy and one of design. So if you have a demand response, that would be one approach, where you say, I have to start this large motor, so I curtail other loads. Another approach would, during that motor start, and then those loads could come back on. Those non-critical loads could come back on once that motor starts. It's really a matter of understanding the nature of the load and making sure that you have adequate resources in order to start it. That said, we do use an advanced coordinated voltage and frequency group. So where a motor typically might have a 6 or 7 service factor, by grouping the voltage and frequency in a coordinated fashion, we can essentially soft start that motor and make the system behave as if it was quite a bit larger than it actually is.
Yeah, you know, we're on a different island right now. We're talking about doing some work with them, and we've been looking at their data. And when they do turn big loads on, we see a huge issue with their frequency, and that's actually the opposite. That's what they're looking at our solution to do. Again, because we're really fast, we can leverage the energy storage as long as it's sized appropriately to be able to keep those frequency issues from continuing for them.
Cool, and thank you. And I know we're at our scheduled time here, but if our panelists are willing, we can stay on for a few more minutes if that's all right with you.
Sure.
And take
sure,
maybe one or two more questions here. Thank you, guys.
Yep.
And actually, there's one question here about microinverters. This is for John. What's the average cycle life of the devices, and does providing short circuit current and fast responding services reduce their lifetime?
Yeah, so when we look at the microinverter component itself, it has a 20-year warranty on it, and that's what we designed for, is a 20-year service life. When we look at the energy storage subsystem, you have to look at that a little bit differently. To some degree, it is a consumable. The current storage product that we're offering has a 10-year warranty, and that's assuming full 100% utilization of that storage component on a daily basis. So, but in the case of storage, if I have a car, I expect the car is going to last, I don't know, say 20 years, but I also have the expectation that I may need to change the tires and the brakes and so on periodically. And today I would view storage as a consumable item, albeit one that's on a pretty long period between replacements.
And thanks for that, John. And we'll take maybe time for maybe two more questions here. One here is someone's asking about the communication layer. Right? Since you have so many different resources, what kind of communication layer do you have? Do you need, what are the requirements on that in order to actually make your system function? A quick answer from each of you.
Yeah, this is Lee. Quick answer. So we are willing to use an all of the above philosophy. A lot like in the Maui example, we could do it all. They already had fiber to all the assets. We didn't bring any synchrophasers. It was already in existing hardware. It was already connected, so there wasn't a lot of work to do there, and we got to be very fast. We are also talking to wireless companies and have worked with wireless as well. So it's really whatever is available to make it work.
Yeah, on our side, our hub includes a standard wired Ethernet interface. So if the customer has broadband already, they can use that. That can also be interfaced, for example, to an AMI system, either wirelessly or wired, via serial connection. And then we also have a redundant communication channel that's optional that would allow that to go command and control over the cellular data system.
Great, thanks. And actually, there's one here about the limits of your system. I mean, how many nodes can you handle?
So from a PICE. By the way, PICE. I know that's interesting sounding. The X is silent, so that's why it's PICE. And so each instance of PICE can handle about 1,000 resources, 1,000 inverters. What allows it to scale more than that, really to no known limit, is the fact that one PICE instance can look like one resource to another instance of PICE. So from a hierarchical approach, we can scale to millions of resources.
Yeah, and on the Enphase side, each one of our hubs can theoretically communicate with about 1,000 inverters. However, if you start running into some bandwidth limitations for the power line carrier, so for communications where we're doing essentially an off-grid type scenario, we recommend that each hub be configured for no more than about 250 micros, but you can have multiple hubs at a single site, and they will coordinate between each other as well.
Great. And I guess one final question here is kind of about spinning reserve, and in terms of microgrid design. Do you have a sense of what we're talking about inverter based resources here? How much spinning reserve is really required to go through actually get through these kinds of weather events? Do you really need it? Any comments there?
Yeah, so in general, I think energy storage will definitely replace spinning reserve based on how much you have. But what we are looking at and proposals that we have made and we're looking forward to doing is on islands have zero traditional spinning reserve, and basically have the battery in the cycle pick up the loss of any variability. And we even believe that even in the face of losing a connection to a major resource, we can act fast enough to pick that up.
Great, thanks. And then finally, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I would concur that that the battery can, appropriately sized battery can essentially take the place of spinning reserve. And we're already seeing that as a trend for economic reasons. We're seeing batteries replacing fast responding peaker plants. So it's clear that batteries can do that. It's just a matter of sizing them appropriately for the application.
And what's really exciting about energy storage, I think it's worth saying this, is while it's there for the spinning reserve, it is also there controlling frequency. And it is also there controlling voltage. It's also there shifting resources to when they're better used. So, and I can go on and on with the list. So you're not using it just for one function. You really, at least PICE can stack all those functions together.
Great. Well, thanks, sir, for that. Both of you. We are definitely out of time. We appreciate that you were willing to stay a little bit longer. We do have some other questions. We apologize for not being able to get to them. What we'll do is we'll do our best. If we can go to meeting, we'll let us save them, and if it's possible, we'll try to follow up with you individually.
Yeah, and people can reach out. I think our email address is probably on our presentations. That's fine.
We'll make sure to post everybody's contact information on the energy storage database website so that folks can get contact, as well as to the Strategen Webinars website, so that they can get everybody's contact information here.
Great.
Any concluding remarks from anybody?
Well, I just want to say, thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you, John and Lee, for your time today, and also to Sandia and DOE for their support in putting this together. We do, this is the first of these, and looking forward to more. We would definitely love your feedback, and there will be an opportunity to complete a survey at the end here. And then
and we'd love to have everybody sign up for the next webinar on deploying energy storage for resilience, where we're going to get much more of the community and utility perspective on how storage solutions are actually being implemented for resilience purposes. And that's on Thursday, May 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Go to strategen.com/webinars to sign up. Thrilled to continue the conversation because obviously there's never enough time to get to everybody's questions, and hopefully we'll get to more of them next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Take care, and see you in a month.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great.